Welcome to Wellspring Community Church online worship. I'm Wendy Musgrave, the pastor at Wellspring. Thank you so much for being here today. You are welcome here. We've had another week of unraveling, haven't we? And it has been quite a doozy. Winds and storms were not merely dramatic elements in stories or metaphors, but really powerful threats that we've weathered and are still struggling to recover from. The devastation surrounds us. We've often talked about how the loss of a tree can feel like the loss of a dear friend, and we have lost so many trees this week. So many buildings have been damaged, vehicles overturned, businesses who were already struggling now have more loss to deal with. This week, over 13 million acres of corn and soybeans in Iowa have been impacted by the storm. This is devastating for farmers and for businesses in our economy that was already struggling. So many homes have been damaged. Many are unlivable because of the storm damage. I heard yesterday that over 1,000 homes in Cedar Rapids alone are unlivable. And COVID-19 makes the sheltering of those displaced by the storms all the more challenging. It has been quite a week. Power outages, all the losses of perishable food, dealing with the heat without the aid of fans and air conditioning. Some people will have gone for more than a week without power before it's finally restored. It's been quite a week. Hurricane-force winds swept across Iowa and the Midwest. A derecho. Now, I have lived in Iowa for my entire life, with the exception of 3.5 years when I lived on the East Coast, and I have never heard of this kind of a storm before. But I can tell you that I won't soon forget it. My heart and my prayers go out to all of those suffering in the aftermath of the storm. This week, we have waited for the lights to come on. We have waited for power and connection to be restored. The very real struggles of this week have offered us fruitful metaphors to ponder. How is it that we reestablish and we maintain our connection to the source of true power and light? As we begin worship today, let us light a candle and set our intention on our connection to the source of light and love and life. As we connect with the source, I invite you to slow down and take a moment just to breathe. As we settle into awareness of the presence of the source of light and love and life, I'm going to share a poem entitled Unraveled by Joy and Surprise by Sarah R. There are days that are physically heavy, days that weigh us down like a weighted blanket, days where eyelids and feet struggle to lift. I call those my heavy days. But there are also days that are nothing but gold, days where laughter brings a buoyancy, and we turn into balloons that explore the open sky. And those kinds of days are holy days. Days where the darkness of night is unraveled by the brightness of dawn. Days where I cannot catch my breath because laughter and music are an ever-flowing stream. Days where my heart soars high above my body, pointing out the beauty of this world. And on those days, I take pictures. And on those days, I press them into scrapbooks so that on heavy days, when joy feels out of reach, I can open the pages, see our laughing faces, and say, wasn't God close? Wasn't God close? Our story of unraveling this week comes from the book of Genesis, chapter 18, verses 1 through 15, and 21, verses 1 through 7. The Lord appeared to Abraham at the oaks of Mamre, where he sat at the entrance of his tent in the day's heat. He looked up and suddenly saw 3 men standing near. As soon as he saw them, he ran from his tent entrance to greet them and bowed deeply. He said, "Sirs, if you would be so kind, don't pass by your servant. Let a little water be brought to you, so you may wash your feet and refresh yourselves under the tree. Let me offer you a little bread, so you will feel stronger, and after that you may leave your servant and go on your way, since you have visited your servant." They responded, "Fine, do just as you have said." So Abraham hurried to Sarah at his tent and said, "Hurry, knead 3 shayes of the finest flour and bake some baked goods." Abraham ran to the cattle, took a healthy calf, gave it to a young servant who prepared it quickly. Then Abraham took butter, milk, and the calf that had been prepared and put the food in front of them and stood under the tree near them as they ate. They said to him, "Where's your wife Sarah?" And he said, "Right here in the tent." Then one of the men said, "I will definitely return to you about this time next year. Then your wife Sarah will have a son." Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were both very old. Sarah was no longer menstruating. So Sarah laughed to herself, thinking, "I'm no longer able to have children, and my husband's old." The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh and say, 'Give me birth at my age'? Is anything too difficult for the Lord? When I return to you about this time next year, Sarah will have a son." Sarah lied and said, "I didn't laugh," because she was frightened. But he said, "No, you laughed." The Lord was attentive to Sarah just as he had said, and the Lord carried out just what he had promised her. She became pregnant and gave birth to a son for Abraham when he was old, at the very time God had told him. Abraham named his son, the one Sarah bore him, Isaac. Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, just as God has commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born. Sarah said, "God has given me laughter. Everyone who hears about it will laugh with me." She said, "Who could have told Abraham that Sarah would nurse sons? But now I've given birth to a son when he was old." Most people who know me know that I love to laugh. I kind of can't help it. My family laughs a lot. When I think back to my family gatherings when we were growing up, it's the abundant laughter that I remember. Laughing is just what we do when we get together. My mom's family is especially full of laughter, and she tells a story of when she was a child and it was time to go to bed. Sometimes they would play a game. One would start by saying, "Ha," and then the next would say, "Ha, ha," and then the next would say, "Ha, ha, ha," and it would make its way around the 7 siblings. Now, my mom was sibling number 5, and it rarely got to her before they all erupted into laughter. At which point, my grandpa would yell up the stairs and say, "Settle down, kids, it's bedtime." And so they would settle down for just a minute until someone would whisper, "Ha," And then they would all erupt in laughter again. And then, of course, my grandpa would yell up the stairs and say, "Settle down or I'm coming up there." And this would continue until they would finally hear those footsteps coming up the stairs. Laughter can definitely unravel bedtime. Laughter can unravel us. I know I've been unraveled by laughter many times in my life. Sometimes laughter has helped me to lighten up a little bit when I was taking myself just way too seriously. Other times, laughter helped me to kind of get a little bit of perspective. I'm reminded of that scene in Mary Poppins when their effervescent laughter causes them to have their tea party on the ceiling as they sing the words, "I love to laugh." Laughter is buoyant, and things tend to look just a little bit different from a bird's eye view. Sometimes laughter is just a relief from stress and worry. Theologian Walter Brueggemann has said that laughter is a biblical way of receiving newness which cannot be explained. Unexplainable newness unravels into laughter for Sarah in our story from Genesis today. Sarah, and anyone who hears her story, is unraveled by joy when they hear that she finally, after all of her waiting, held in her arms the son in which they named Laughter. Isaac literally means laughter. In our story for today, unexpected visitors with an unexpected message lead to unexpected laughter. As our story opens, the divine appeared to Abraham at his tent in the form of 3 travelers. Abraham rushed out to greet the travelers and implored them to allow him to provide them with refreshment. There's so much humor in this story. First of all, Abraham modestly downplays what he's offering: a splash of water, a morsel of bread. And then he proceeds to frantically engage Sarah and their servants in the rushing about to prepare a feast for their guests. With the energy of this frantic pace, I can imagine this scene as classic sitcom material. For some reason this week, and maybe it's just because I've needed a little bit of comic relief, as I read this scene, I imagined it kind of like a scene from I Love Lucy. 3 shades of flour are enough to prepare 300 loaves of bread. Can you imagine Sarah rushing about to prepare 300 loaves of bread? And Abraham had asked Sarah not to prepare just ordinary bread, but to take their finest flour and prepare delicious cakes. This is incredibly, hilariously abundant response. 300 loaves for 3 visitors who are just passing by. This is quite a morsel. They prepare a calf. They provided butter and milk. This is a feast. Now, hospitality is a major theme that's woven throughout the Bible. Hospitality in the desert was a matter of life and death. Travelers had to rely on the hospitality of others along their way for water and shade and food in order to survive their journeys. So offering hospitality to a stranger was nothing out of the ordinary. But our storyteller in Genesis wants us to know that the level of this hospitality was ridiculously above and beyond what was normal. As Abraham watched the guests enjoy the feast that they had prepared, the guests inquired of Abraham, "Where is your wife, Sarah?" Of course, Sarah was listening, hiding behind the door of the tent. And she heard the guests say, "When we come back a year from now, she is going to be holding in her arms her very own son." And at this, 89-year-old Sarah laughed. I mean, can you blame her? Sarah may have thought that her little snicker behind the door would go unnoticed. But our story says the Lord said to Sarah, "Why do you laugh? Why do you laugh?" It bothers me that so often this question has been interpreted as a rebuke of Sarah's disbelief. Of course, Abraham had previously fallen on his face in laughter when he was told of this news, but no one ever questioned him why he laughed. Why do you laugh? I've wondered this week if this question could have been asked not as a rebuke, but more in a spirit of loving compassion. Kind of like in our story last week of Jesus healing Legion, could this question have let Sarah know that she had truly been seen? That even as she was hiding, her story, her life mattered, and that she had truly been seen. Why does she laugh? I've been wondering just what kind of laugh was this? There's many different kinds of laughter. Laughter can be warm and disarming, and it can also be sharp and harsh. Laughter can be comfortable, and it can also be incredibly awkward. We all know the different way it feels when we are being laughed at versus when we are being laughed with. We know the joy that is to be found when we're able to laugh at ourselves. We've probably all had to suppress a laugh when that laugh wasn't quite appropriate in the circumstance. And maybe we've even faked a laugh when the laugh was appropriate, but we just really didn't feel like laughing. Our story today says Sarah laughed to herself. And there are many layers of meaning in these words. The Hebrew paints this laugh to herself as a belly laugh. Locating the laugh in Sarah's belly, we are left to imagine a laugh rumbling around in her empty womb. This laugh is bathed in sorrow. In her infertility, Sarah had been suffering for years, and now these three strangers had shown up and said that when they visit next year, she was going to be holding the son that she had been waiting for so long. For Sarah, I wonder if hearing this didn't just add insult to injury. Maybe that's why she laughed. This belly laugh resonates from her empty womb, the source of Sarah's deepest pain. Hearing the laughter, the divine guest then also recognizes Sarah's pain. She'd been promised a child years ago, only to watch the years tick by with the promise unfulfilled, her deepest hopes unrealized. In 1951, poet Langston Hughes wrote of a dream deferred in his poem entitled Harlem. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat? Or crust and sugar over like syrupy sweet? Or maybe it just sags like a heavy load? Or does it explode? Sarah's reaction to the news she overheard sounds kind of like, how can you speak of this promise now that I am old and withered? In her dream deferred, perhaps Sarah was wondering if her womb had been dried up like a raisin in the sun. Sarah's grief over her dream deferred then explodes in laughter. Hearing the promise repeated may have felt like a kick in the gut. Perhaps Sarah was laughing just to keep from crying. In this story of unexpected joy and surprises, the funny thing is that the joy wasn't always unexpected. In fact, it had been faithfully expected for so long that it seems Sarah just finally stopped expecting it. Like the boy who cried wolf, I would guess that the words of promise were a struggle to take seriously after 25 years of promise with no child. I mean, how exciting that promise must have sounded 25 years earlier. The promise brought joy and faith that God would deliver on these promises, only to have years and years and years go by with no baby. For Sarah, there's not just heartbreak, but also shame. In this ancient patriarchal society, women were valued pretty much exclusively for their ability to procreate. In the absence of modern medical science, women were blamed for all problems of infertility. There must have been something wrong with her. There was deep shame for a woman who couldn't provide heirs for her husband. But the divine promise had to really crank the pressure up a notch. You see, this couple had told everyone that God spoke to them and that they were to leave their home and to venture out in the promise of land and blessings, and most importantly to Sarah, a child. Their fortunes had multiplied. They had been blessed many times, but 25 years later, there was still no child. The talk of the town can be harsh, and I can imagine that the laughs had often been at Sarah's expense during the long wait for a son. Look over there. There's that old woman who said God had promised her a son. Maybe Sarah had been expected surprises and joy for so long that she had tired of expecting them. There was so much waiting. She was 65 when she was promised a son, and she was 90 when that promise was eventually fulfilled. Sarah's laugh may have been in self-protection. She may have been reluctant to believe, only to be disappointed once again. In her desperation, she had even resorted to creatively reinterpreting the promise, giving her slave Hagar to her husband to produce the son that God had promised him. This was very wrong, and this caused pain and sorrow for all involved, not the least of which was Sarah's slave Hagar, whose body had been violated. And then she and her son were merely used as pawns and discarded by Sarah and Abraham. In her jealousy, Sarah had Hagar and her son Ishmael sent into the wilderness, a sure death sentence without the protection and promise lavished by God upon Hagar. Sometimes there is nothing to do but laugh. Sometimes laughter is all that keeps us from crying. Some days I think that laughter is all that keeps me going, putting one foot in front of the other. They say that laughter is the best medicine, and I know it has been for me at times. Physiological things happen when we laugh. Laughing relieves stress. It improves our immune system. It relieves pain. It increases our personal satisfaction, and it improves our mood. I know I was incredibly refreshed on Thursday evening when we were able to gather in person at Greenwood Park and just laugh together. Sarah's laughter unravels from painful, sorrow-soaked laughter of hopelessness into joyful laughter of new life. As her belly swells with the new life that is growing within her, Sarah's belly laugh of disillusionment and hopelessness transformed into laughter of joy. Sarah said, "God has given me laughter." No longer being laughed at, Sarah exclaims, "Everyone who hears what God has done for and through me will laugh with me." Laughter can bring us together and remind us of our connection. Brueggemann has written, "Laughter is the biblical way of receiving newness which cannot be explained. The newness is a sheer gift, underived, unwarranted. Barrenness has now become ludicrous. It can now be laughed at because there is full joy." The Psalms remind us that while weeping may endure for the night, joy comes with the dawn. The Gospels remind us that joy and hope and promise and love and new life have the last laugh. Again this week, it is the questions in this passage which stick with me, especially the question, is anything too difficult, too wonderful for the Lord? Is anything impossible for God? As Sarah's hope in the promise ran thin in the light of her dream deferred, her laughter erupted in feelings of as if and if only. As Sarah's attention was focused only on all of the reasons that her dream deferred was unlikely to ever be fulfilled, when she only saw this as impossible, the mysterious guest, God in disguise, asks the question, is anything too difficult, too wonderful for the Lord? Is anything impossible for God? What a question for Abraham and Sarah, and what a question for us in a time such as this. Whether we are looking at the big stuff like global pandemic or systematic racism, environmental concerns, or maybe we're looking a little closer to the internal stuff, the smaller individual stuff like broken relationships or broken hearts, those inner demons that we struggle with. This is quite a question to sit with. Is anything too difficult for the God of healing? For the God of justice? Is anything impossible for the God of life and love? It seems there are plenty of spaces in our world and in our lives that hope, at the promise of wholeness and of life and restoration and justice and resurrection seem downright laughable. We might scoff when we hear hopeful promise of a dream deferred, repeated. Like Thomas, we might be tempted to think, I'll believe that when I see it. The good news of the gospel that we are blessed to place our hope in, even when we can't yet see the fulfillment, is that everywhere, anywhere, where love or justice or peace seem ludicrous, when that seems completely laughable, the Spirit is already at work there and inviting us to join her. If the promise to the Hebrew people is any indication, it's probably going to take some time. It's probably going to involve some waiting, and some of that waiting is going to be painful. We're probably going to find ourselves crying out at times, how long? This waiting isn't going to be without its hardships. In fact, the hardships may just define the journey. But Sarah's story helps us to see the value of tenacious hope in the waiting. Sarah's laughter helps us to hope in the promise that in the end, God will transform our private inner laughter of disbelief and disillusionment into the shared, unifying laughter of astonishment, joy, and delight. How wonderful this will be. And is anything too wonderful for God?